I woke up to the sound of loud honking. Not the usual chirping birds, not the rustling of leaves, but an angry, deep horn that rattled my bones. My first thought was that maybe my old tractor had somehow started rolling down the hill, but as I pulled myself out of bed and peeked out the window, my jaw dropped. A semi-truck, a massive, gleaming, 18-wheeler monstrosity, was parked right in front of my driveway. Not just a little to the side, completely blocking my way out. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was still dreaming, but no. It was very much real. And the worst part? I already had a gut feeling about who was behind this. Karen. That woman had been a thorn in my side ever since she moved into the fancy new housing development across the road. My family had owned this farm for 3 generations, long before their cookie-cutter mansions were even a blueprint. Karen and her HOA crew had tried everything to push me out. From complaints about my barn being an eyesore to ridiculous fines for things like overgrown grass, they were determined to make my life miserable. I threw on my boots and stomped outside, expecting to see some poor truck driver lost and confused. Instead, I found Karen herself, standing next to the truck, arms crossed, smiling like she had just won the lottery. "Oh, good morning," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I was just about to come knock on your door." I didn't return the smile. "Karen, why the hell is there a semi-truck blocking my driveway?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's temporary. We're having some deliveries made for the HOA community event this weekend. The roads in our neighborhood are too narrow, so we needed a better place for unloading." I blinked. "So you chose my driveway?" "Well," she said, tilting her head, "it's the only space big enough nearby. And honestly, it's not like you go anywhere. I mean, what could you possibly need to drive out for? Cow milking emergencies?" She laughed, as if she had just cracked the funniest joke in history. I gritted my teeth. I had 3 deliveries coming in today: feed for my animals, supplies for repairing my fence, and a visit from my vet. This truck wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-blown disaster. "You've got 10 minutes to move it," I said, crossing my arms. Karen's fake smile vanished. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. It's a community event, for the greater good. You can wait." I clenched my fists. "Karen, you don't own this land. You don't get to decide who parks here." She let out an exaggerated sigh. "Look, no change is hard for older folks like you, but this neighborhood is evolving. Maybe it's time you accept that your farm isn't the center of the universe anymore." The way she said it, like I was some kind of old relic standing in the way of progress, made my blood boil. But I wasn't about to lose my temper. No, I had a better idea. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "You do what you have to do." Karen smirked, clearly thinking she had won. "See? Now that's the spirit. It's just for a couple of days." I nodded. "Sure. A couple of days." She turned on her heel and strutted away, leaving me standing there, already crafting my revenge. Karen thought she had won, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I had spent my entire life on this farm, handling everything from broken fences to stubborn animals, and if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was solving problems creatively. If she wanted to play dirty, I was more than happy to join the game. But I wasn't going to yell, argue, or beg. No, I was going to make sure that she regretted ever thinking she could walk over me. I walked back to my house, grabbed my phone, and made a few calls. First, I let my delivery guys know they wouldn't be able to make it today. They weren't happy, but they understood. Then, I called up one of my old buddies, Tom, who ran the local repair shop. Tom had a particular set of skills that I knew would come in handy. "Tom, how fast can you get me a tire deflator kit?" I asked. He chuckled. "Why? Got a pesky visitor?" You could say that. Well, lucky for you, I got a set right here. I'll swing by. While waiting for Tom, I took my sweet time inspecting the massive semi-truck that Karen had so generously gifted me. The truck was brand new, gleaming in the morning sun, probably rented by the HOA for their fancy event. But the one thing Karen didn't consider? I knew this land like the back of my hand. And she had parked that truck in the absolute worst possible spot. The ground wasn't solid. It had rained a few days ago, and the dirt underneath was still soft. The truck was heavy, and if the tires lost just a little bit of air, it would sink in like a stone in quicksand. I smiled to myself, already imagining the look on Karen's face when she realized her precious delivery vehicle was going nowhere. Tom arrived a few minutes later, tossing me the kit. "This should do the trick," he said. "Need any help?" I shook my head. "Nah, I got this." I walked up to the truck and got to work. Slow, controlled, deliberate. I didn't want the tires to go completely flat, just enough to sink the truck into the soft ground. I worked my way around, deflating them ever so slightly, just enough that they looked normal to the untrained eye. But the real magic would happen when someone tried to move it. By the time I was done, I stepped back, admiring my work. The truck looked fine, sitting there just as before. But the moment someone revved that engine and tried to pull out, it would dig itself deeper into the dirt. And no amount of pushing or pulling would save it without a heavy-duty tow truck. Feeling satisfied, I went back inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, I heard voices outside. Karen had returned with some of her HOA lackeys, no doubt to check on her grand plan. I watched from my porch as she strutted around, making a big show of inspecting the truck, probably imagining herself as the queen of logistics. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. She waved over a man wearing a bright orange vest, probably the truck driver, and gave him some orders. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and hit the gas. The truck growled, the tires spun for a second, and then, nothing. The heavy weight pressed into the soft dirt, and instead of moving forward, the truck sank an inch deeper. The driver frowned, put the truck into reverse, and tried again. The back tires spun uselessly, kicking up clumps of dirt but not moving an inch. Karen's smile began to slip. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the show. The driver tried again. This time, he pushed the gas harder, and the truck let out an angry roar as its wheels dug deeper into the ground. Panic set in. Karen started waving her arms, barking orders at the other HOA members, but nothing was working. She stomped over to the driver's side window, and though I couldn't hear the conversation, I could see the frustration in her movements. She pointed at the ground, then at the truck, then at the sky, like she was trying to blame the weather or the land itself for her mistake. A few more attempts later, the truck was now buried up to its axle in soft dirt. Karen turned and stormed toward my house, her face red with rage. I took another sip of my coffee, waiting for her to explode. She didn't disappoint. "You did this," she screeched the moment she stepped onto my porch. I raised an eyebrow. "Did what?" "You made the truck sink," she said, flailing her arms. You messed with it." I took another sip of coffee, completely unbothered. "Karen, I didn't touch your truck. It's parked on my land. Maybe you should have considered the soil conditions before blocking my driveway." Her jaw clenched. She knew she couldn't prove anything. But that didn't stop her from trying. "You need to fix this. Call someone and tow it out." I leaned back. "Not my problem." She gawked at me, completely thrown off. "Excuse me? You heard me. I didn't park that truck here." "You did." "I didn't tell anyone to drive a multi-ton vehicle onto soft farmland." "You did. And now, you're asking me to fix your mistake? I shook my head. Nope. That's not how this works. Karen sputtered, her face turning an even deeper shade of red. This is illegal. You're sabotaging the HOA event. I chuckled. Karen, if you'd bothered to check the property laws, you'd know that this land belongs to me. Your truck is trespassing. Legally, I could have it towed right now at your expense. But lucky for you, I'm a generous guy. She folded her arms. What do you want? I smiled. Move the truck. Apologize. And I won't charge you for trespassing. Karen's nose flared, but she had no other option. She stormed back toward the truck, yelling at the driver and some HOA members to figure it out. I finished my coffee, walked back inside, and waited. The real fun was about to begin. Karen stomped away from my porch, her fists clenched at her sides as she barked orders at the truck driver and the few HOA members who had followed her to my property. The sight of her pacing back and forth, throwing her hands in the air, and pointing aggressively at the sinking truck was nothing short of hilarious. But I kept a straight face as I leaned against the railing, watching the mess unfold. The truck was now stuck so deep in the soft dirt that even its undercarriage was nearly touching the ground. The more they tried to move it, the worse it got. The driver revved the engine again, but the only result was a loud growl from the truck as the wheels spun uselessly, kicking up dirt in every direction. A few of the HOA members, dressed in their neatly pressed shirts and polished shoes, tried pushing from the back, but it was a completely pointless effort. The truck wasn't moving. If anything, the added force was only making the tires sink further. Karen pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping furiously on the screen. She was probably calling a tow truck, but I already knew how that was going to go. This wasn't some small car stuck in a ditch. This was a fully loaded semi-truck on unstable ground. A regular tow truck wouldn't be able to budge it, and the kind of heavy-duty tow service they would need was going to cost an absolute fortune. I figured it would take no more than a few minutes before she came back, demanding I help her. Sure enough, after a heated phone conversation that involved plenty of frustrated pacing and exaggerated sighs, she turned back toward me. Her steps were slower this time, like she was trying to swallow her pride before speaking. I could already tell she was about to ask for something, and I wasn't about to make it easy for her. I crossed my arms, waiting for her to speak. Her face twitched as she hesitated, clearly struggling with the idea of having to ask me for help. After a deep breath, she finally muttered something, but I just shook my head, pretending not to hear her. That seemed to push her over the edge, and she snapped back into her usual bossy demeanor, listing demands as if I owed her anything. I let her rant for a while before calmly telling her the same thing I had earlier. The truck was on my land, blocking my driveway, and if she wanted my help, she needed to take full responsibility. She scoffed at the idea, insisting that this was a temporary inconvenience for the greater good of the community. But that argument wasn't getting her anywhere. I could see the moment she realized she had no choice. The anger in her face gave way to frustration, and then finally, resignation. She gritted her teeth as she mumbled an apology, though it was so forced that I barely understood it. I made her say it again, just to make sure she really meant it. Then I told her she had 1 hour to figure out a solution before I called the sheriff and had the truck officially towed at her expense. That lit a fire under her. She immediately started making more phone calls, pacing up and down my driveway like a caged animal. Her frustration only grew as each call ended with what I could only assume was more bad news. I already knew what was happening. No tow company wanted to deal with the situation without a massive upfront payment. The HOA might have money, but they weren't going to like throwing thousands of dollars down the drain just to fix Karen's mistake. Meanwhile, I went back inside and made myself lunch. By the time I was done eating, I peeked outside again to find Karen and her group standing in a tight circle, whispering amongst themselves. They were up to something, and I could already guess what. They weren't going to pay for a professional tow, so they were probably planning to try pulling it out themselves. That was going to be a disaster. I watched as a few of them walked off and returned a short while later with chains, ropes, and even a small pickup truck. I had to bite back a laugh. There was no way their tiny vehicle was going to move something that weighed several tons. But they were desperate, and desperate people did stupid things. They hooked up the chains, attaching them from the pickup's rear to the front of the semi-truck. The driver of the pickup revved the engine, and for a second, I thought the chains might snap under the strain. The pickup lurched forward, its tires screeching against the pavement as it strained against the weight. The semi-truck barely moved. They tried again, this time with more people pushing from behind, but all they managed to do was create an even deeper rut in the ground. Karen was losing her patience. She kept waving her arms, shouting instructions, but nothing was working. Then, in a last-ditch effort, they decided to add another vehicle to the mix. They brought over an SUV and hooked it up behind the pickup, hoping that the extra force would make a difference. I leaned against the porch railing, sipping my drink as I watched them struggle. I could see how tense Karen was. She was completely out of her depth, and she knew it. But she was too stubborn to admit defeat. She kept pushing her team harder, making them try again and again. The more they struggled, the worse the situation became. Eventually, they had 3 vehicles hooked up in a chain, all revving their engines in unison, trying to dislodge the semi-truck. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, I wondered if they might actually succeed in moving it. Then, just as the pickup and SUV surged forward together, there was a loud snap. The chains, which had already been straining under the pressure, gave way. The sudden release of tension sent the vehicles lunging forward, causing the SUV to skid sideways into a ditch. The pickup's tires spun out, kicking up a cloud of dust as the driver fought to regain control. The whole scene was pure chaos, with Karen shouting at the top of her lungs while everyone scrambled to check the damage. I let out a slow breath, watching as reality finally hit her. The truck wasn't going anywhere. The vehicles they had used were now in worse condition than before, and they had only managed to make the entire situation worse. Karen's face was a picture of pure frustration as she turned to glare at me. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out a way to blame me for what had just happened. But there was no way out of this. She had created this mess, and she was the only one who could clean it up. The thought of leaving them to struggle for a little longer was tempting, but I had a better idea. I picked up my phone and dialed a number, knowing exactly who to call. I wasn't going to let Karen walk away from this without learning a proper lesson. If she thought she had problems now, she had no idea what was coming next. I watched as the mess Karen had created continued to unravel before her eyes. The semi-truck was now so deeply stuck that any attempt to move it was making the situation worse. The vehicles they had used for pulling were in no better condition. The SUV that had skidded into the ditch was now partially buried in mud, its tires uselessly spinning every time the driver tried to reverse. The pickup truck, after multiple failed attempts, had started overheating, and a few wisps of smoke were curling up from the hood. Karen was pacing in circles, her face twisted in frustration as she gripped her phone, probably trying to find a way out of the disaster. The small group of HOA members that had come to assist her were now keeping their distance, looking more and more uncomfortable with every passing second. They had clearly expected this to be an easy fix, but now they were stuck in the middle of a problem they didn't know how to solve. I took my time finishing my drink before I dialed the number I had been waiting to call. My friend, Dave, owned a heavy-duty towing company just outside of town, and I knew he had the exact kind of massive wrecker needed to pull a semi-truck out of soft soil. When he picked up, I didn't waste any time explaining the situation. He let out a long whistle when I told him the details and laughed when I mentioned Karen's involvement. He knew exactly the type of people the HOA attracted and had dealt with their entitled behavior before. He told me he could send a truck right away, but he also gave me a warning. A job like this wasn't cheap. I already knew that. Karen and her HOA were about to get hit with a bill so large that they'd feel it in their bones. After I hung up, I casually made my way back outside and leaned against my fence, watching the growing panic settle in on Karen's face. The calls she had been making clearly weren't working out the way she had hoped. She was now pacing even faster, switching between yelling into her phone and barking at the few remaining HOA members who hadn't already started slipping away, realizing this was no longer their problem. The ones who stayed were the die-hard HOA loyalists, the ones who believed their little neighborhood association had real power beyond the few streets they controlled. They were still under the illusion that they could bully their way out of this. That illusion was about to shatter. Within 20 minutes, the distant sound of a heavy diesel engine rumbled through the air, growing louder as it approached. I turned my head just in time to see Dave's massive red wrecker truck rolling down the road, its presence alone commanding attention. The vehicle was built for serious recoveries, the kind of jobs that involved flipped-over semis on highways and wrecked trailers in ditches. It pulled up slowly, stopping just in front of my driveway. Dave stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud, and adjusted his cap as he took in the scene before him. His expression said everything. He knew this was going to be a nightmare for Karen. Karen's shoulders tensed as she turned and saw the massive tow truck. She looked at me, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was fear. She had just realized what this meant. The problem she had tried to brush off as an inconvenience had now become a full-blown financial disaster. Tow companies didn't work for free, and the type of truck that had just arrived wasn't cheap to hire. The fact that she had refused to listen to me earlier only made it worse. This was entirely her fault, and now she had no choice but to deal with the consequences. Dave took his time inspecting the situation, walking around the truck, checking how deep it had sunk, and shaking his head as he kicked at the soft dirt. He crouched down to examine the wheels before standing back up and muttering something under his breath. I already knew what he was thinking. This wasn't going to be easy. The more the truck had tried to move, the deeper it had buried itself. He walked back to me, a small smirk on his face, and let me know that this was going to take extra equipment and time. I nodded, already knowing what was coming next. Karen had made a mistake that was going to cost her thousands of dollars, and there was no getting around it. Karen, clearly realizing that she had lost control of the situation, walked over with her arms crossed, trying to maintain some level of authority, but it was clear that she was struggling to keep up the act. She asked how long this was going to take, but the real question in her voice was about the cost. Dave didn't sugarcoat it. He listed off the pricing, breaking down each charge in detail. The use of heavy-duty towing equipment, the time needed for labor, the difficulty of the job. By the time he was done explaining, Karen's face had lost all color. The final number was brutal. It was a price that HOA funds couldn't just casually cover, and from the look in her eyes, she knew it. She tried to argue, but Dave was firm. This was a business, and a job like this required full payment up front. If she didn't like it, she could find another way to remove the truck, but she already knew there was no other way. I stayed silent, watching as she tried to negotiate, but it was hopeless. The more she pushed, the more obvious it became that she was backed into a corner. She finally turned to me, her face twisted in frustration. I could already see the gears turning in her head. She was desperate for a way out, some loophole she could use to shift the problem onto someone else. She knew I had one, and she hated it. But I wasn't going to let her get away without fully understanding her mistake. I reminded her, calmly and clearly, that this all could have been avoided if she had simply respected my property from the beginning. If she had asked permission, if she had taken my warning seriously, none of this would have happened. But she had chosen arrogance, and now she had to pay for it. She tried one last time to shift the blame, claiming that this was an unfair situation, that she had only parked the truck here because it was necessary for the community event, but her argument fell flat. The HOA members who had been standing behind her were no longer nodding along in support. Some of them had already started walking away, wanting to distance themselves from the mess. No one was backing her up anymore. She was completely alone in this disaster. She had built a reputation as the person who controlled the neighborhood, but now, everyone was seeing the truth. She had no real power outside of the little bubble she had created for herself. With no other option, she finally gave in, pulling out her checkbook with shaky hands and writing down the amount that Dave had quoted. I could see how much it pained her to part with that money. This wasn't just about the cost, it was about the humiliation of being forced to pay for a mistake she had refused to acknowledge. She handed over the check without another word, her lips pressed into a tight line. Dave took it, gave her a polite nod, and went to work. The entire process took over an hour, involving heavy chains, careful maneuvering, and a lot of effort from the tow truck. But eventually, the semi was pulled free from the mud, its tires once again resting on solid ground. I watched as Karen's posture stiffened, her face filled with rage as she realized just how much of her precious HOA budget had just disappeared. She had come here thinking she could throw her weight around and control the situation. Instead, she had walked straight into a disaster of her own making. And I wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about teaching her a lesson, it was about making sure she never tried something like this again. I had one more move left to play, and it was going to be the final nail in the coffin. As soon as the truck was freed from the mud and sitting back on solid ground, I watched Karen try to regain control of the situation. The relief on her face when the semi was finally unstuck was short-lived as she realized how much of a disaster this entire ordeal had become. The truck driver didn't even wait around for her approval. As soon as Dave gave him the all-clear, he climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away, kicking up dirt as he sped off, eager to get away from the madness. The HOA members who had lingered behind began making quiet exits, slipping away one by one as they realized there was no reason for them to stay. They had come expecting an easy solution, but instead, they had witnessed Karen's complete humiliation. No one wanted to be associated with her failure. Karen stood alone, glaring at me, her face still twisted in frustration. The HOA's carefully controlled funds had just taken a massive hit, and she knew it wouldn't be easy to explain why so much money had been wasted. People in her neighborhood weren't going to be happy when they found out their community dues had gone into paying a massive tow bill for a problem that never should have happened in the first place. Her reputation was already crumbling, and I could see the panic in her expression as she tried to figure out what to do next. She wanted to walk away with whatever dignity she had left, but I wasn't going to let her off that easily. I reminded her that while the truck was gone, the damage to my land remained. The deep tire tracks had ruined the driveway, leaving trenches that would need to be filled and leveled. The section of soft dirt where the truck had sunk was now completely torn up, requiring expensive repairs. And that wasn't even considering the destruction left behind by the pickup and SUV that had gotten stuck during their failed rescue attempt. I made it clear that I wasn't just going to let it slide. She had already wasted HOA funds on the towing bill, but now she was going to be personally responsible for fixing the mess she had caused. Her face turned pale as she realized I wasn't bluffing. She tried to argue that it wasn't her responsibility, but she was quickly running out of excuses. No one was backing her up anymore. The HOA board members who usually stood by her decisions were nowhere to be found. The reality was sinking in fast. She had made this mess entirely on her own, and now she had no one else to take the fall for it. She had spent years using intimidation and manipulation to control the people in her neighborhood, but this time, it had backfired completely. She had stepped out of her comfort zone, thinking she could pull the same tricks on someone like me. But I had something she wasn't used to dealing with: complete control over my own land. The silence stretched between us as she struggled to find a way out. I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate how much this was going to cost her and whether she could get out of paying for it. But there was no escaping this one. If she refused to take responsibility, I was fully prepared to take her to court for property damage, and I made sure she knew it. I could almost see the moment she realized she had no options left. Her shoulders sagged slightly as the weight of her failure settled on her. She had come here expecting to show her authority, expecting to prove that she had the power to do whatever she wanted. Instead, she had just learned the hard way that she had no control over me or my property. Grudgingly, she pulled out her checkbook again, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote out another painfully large payment, this time for the cost of repairing my driveway. I took the check from her without a word, letting her stew in her humiliation for a moment longer. She had always looked down on me, acting as if my farm was a relic of the past, something that was just waiting to be replaced by more of her overpriced suburban homes. But today, she had learned that this land wasn't hers to control. This was my home, my property, and she had no power here. As she turned to leave, I knew that this wasn't over for her. She still had to go back to her precious HOA and explain what had happened. She had to tell them that their carefully managed funds had been drained to fix a problem that she had created. And once word got around, which I knew it would, she was going to lose the one thing she valued the most, her influence. People would start questioning her decisions. They would start challenging her. And soon, the very people she had ruled over with an iron grip would be the ones pushing her out. I watched as she walked away, her step stiff with anger, but there was nothing she could do. The battle was over, and she had lost. I had no doubt that she would try to spin the story in her favor, but the truth was too obvious for her to hide. She had let her arrogance get the best of her, and now she was paying the price. As the dust settled and the last of the vehicles disappeared down the road, I took a deep breath, enjoying the quiet once more. The land was mine again, free from interference. The deep tire tracks in the dirt were a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded, but they would be repaired. The most important thing was that Karen had learned a lesson she wouldn't forget anytime soon. She had thought she could walk all over me, but she had only managed to destroy her own reputation in the process. With a satisfied sigh, I turned back toward my house. There was work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Karen wouldn't be bothering me again. She had finally realized that out here, on my land, she had no power at all.